The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the hotel suite like a gunshot, small pieces of a hand-painted teacup scattering across the marble floor, while Vanessa Kensington stood over the wreckage with a satisfied smile stretched across her face. What would you do if the family you were about to marry into took the modest, handmade gifts your loved ones sent for your wedding and smashed them deliberately, one by one, calling everything you cherished a low-class infection? What would you do if they threw the broken pieces into the trash while you stood there watching, forced to absorb every second of the destruction in silence? Grace Bellamy stood frozen in the center of that opulent hotel suite, her hands clenched at her sides, her expression carved from something colder than grief, while Vanessa and her mother, Diane Kensington, laughed together over the wreckage of a family heirloom that had survived 3 generations before arriving in that room. Neither of them, not Diane in her stiff designer suit, not Vanessa admiring her own reflection in a rented luxury mirror, had the faintest idea that in less than 10 minutes, 40 armored vehicles would be sealing off the entire city block outside, and the Crown's Minister of Finance would be walking through that very door carrying steel cases filled with gold. To understand how Grace Bellamy ended up standing silently in a hotel suite watching her family's love be destroyed piece by piece, we need to go back nearly 2 years to a modest, overcrowded social services office on the 3rd floor of a government building where a woman calling herself Grace Bellamy spent her days advocating for struggling families, filling out endless paperwork for housing assistance, and driving home each evening in a second-hand sedan with a cracked windshield she never found time to fix. Nobody in that office, not her supervisor, not the families she helped every single day, not a single soul in her modest rented apartment had any idea that the tired, compassionate social worker filling out benefit applications was, in fact, Her Royal Highness, Princess Grace von Alderfeld, sole heir to one of the wealthiest sovereign dynasties remaining in Europe, a family whose banking holdings, industrial conglomerates, and sovereign wealth fund exceeded, by conservative estimate, well over $2 trillion accumulated across 9 generations of careful stewardship. She had grown up inside a palace of pale limestone corridors and centuries-old portraits, tutored from childhood in diplomacy and protocol, taught early that every friendship carried the invisible weight of political calculation, that every man who smiled at her likely already knew the precise figure of her inheritance before he ever learned her favorite color. By the time she turned 27, Grace had grown utterly exhausted by a life where genuine connection felt impossible, where every potential suitor arrived with calculations already completed. Her mother, the reigning monarch, had reluctantly granted her request for an extended sabbatical from royal duties, transferring interim responsibilities to a trusted regent council, and Grace disappeared into an entirely fabricated identity, complete with forged employment credentials, a modest rented apartment above a laundromat, and a bank account containing only the modest earnings of an entry-level social worker. She wanted, desperately, to discover whether a man could look at her and see only her, without the crushing weight of her birthright distorting every interaction between them. It was during this fragile, hopeful chapter that she met Nathaniel Kensington, a mid-level accountant working for a mid-sized firm, a man whose easy smile and apparent humility initially convinced her she had finally found someone capable of loving her without ulterior motive. In those early months, Nathaniel seemed wonderfully unpretentious, driving a used sedan with a dent in the rear bumper, taking her to modest neighborhood diners, always insisting on splitting the bill evenly, even when his own finances seemed visibly strained. He told her, one evening sitting on a park bench beneath autumn leaves, that he did not care about her lack of family connections or modest circumstances, that all he wanted was to build a life together through hard work and genuine partnership. Grace, starved for exactly this kind of uncomplicated affection, allowed herself to fall completely, believing she had finally found a man who valued her heart over any fortune, hidden or otherwise. The complications began slowly, nearly 8 months into their relationship, when Nathaniel finally introduced Grace to his mother, Diane Kensington, and his 2 sisters, Vanessa and Brittany, a family whose entire identity seemed constructed around the appearance of wealth they did not actually possess. Diane carried designer handbags that were, upon closer inspection, cleverly disguised counterfeits, drove a luxury sedan that Grace would later learn was leased far beyond the family's actual means, and spoke with the particular affected superiority of someone desperately trying to convince the world, and perhaps herself, that she belonged among genuine old money, rather than the precarious financial situation her family actually occupied. From their very first dinner together, Diane's eyes had conducted a slow, deliberate inventory of Grace's simple department store dress, calculating her worth down to the penny before a single word of genuine conversation had passed between them. "So you work in social services," Diane had said that first evening, swirling wine in a glass she had specifically requested be refilled from a more expensive bottle than the one being served to everyone else at the table, her tone carrying that particular brand of performed superiority reserved for people desperately trying to disguise their own financial insecurity. "How charitable of you. I suppose someone needs to handle that sort of work." Vanessa and Brittany had exchanged knowing glances across the table, their own designer outfits, purchased on credit cards already strained to their limits, catching the dim restaurant lighting as they whispered to each other about Grace's modest appearance. The microaggressions multiplied steadily over the following months, growing bolder as Diane and her daughters grew increasingly comfortable expressing their contempt. At a family gathering, Vanessa loudly wondered aloud whether Grace's car would even survive the drive home, gesturing dismissively toward Grace's aging sedan, parked among a row of luxury vehicles, several of which Grace would later discover were rented specifically for that particular event to maintain appearances. At Brittany's birthday celebration, someone left an anonymous note tucked beneath Grace's dinner plate, suggesting that some women simply were not built for the kind of elevated lifestyle the Kensington family aspired to represent. At another gathering, Diane made a great show of gifting Grace a discount gift certificate to help her find something more appropriate to wear to future family functions, a gift that felt less like generosity and more like a calculated public demonstration of exactly how far beneath them they considered her to be. Nathaniel, rather than defending Grace against his family's escalating cruelty, began quietly asking her to simply endure it, framing his requests as necessary sacrifices for family harmony. "They just need time to warm up to you," he explained one night, avoiding her eyes as he said it, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had already decided which battles were worth fighting. "Can you just let it roll off? Once we're married, things will settle down, I promise." Grace, clinging to the fragile hope that the man who once split bills evenly and spoke of building something real together might eventually find the courage to defend her, agreed each time, swallowing insult after insult, telling herself that patience would eventually be rewarded with genuine acceptance. She had no idea, during those long months of quiet endurance, exactly how far the Kensington family's cruelty was ultimately prepared to extend. Wedding planning proceeded despite the mounting tension, largely funded by Grace's modest savings, since Diane had made it explicitly clear during one uncomfortable dinner that the Kensington family's finances, though appearing considerable on the surface, could not reasonably accommodate significant wedding expenses beyond what she vaguely described as family contributions of sentimental value. What Grace did not yet fully understand was that Nathaniel had recently secured what he proudly described to friends and family as a mortgage on a beautiful new estate home. A mansion he claimed represented his rapidly advancing career success, a property Diane had already begun redecorating with expensive furnishings purchased on credit in anticipation of hosting lavish family gatherings there for years to come. Grace's own family, modest and hardworking, had pooled together what little they could afford to send thoughtful, handmade gifts ahead of the wedding. Her grandmother had hand-painted a delicate teacup and saucer set, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, with a handwritten letter describing the set's history, passed down through 3 generations of women in their family. Her mother had knitted a soft, intricate throw blanket in the Bellamy family's traditional pattern, a design that had adorned every wedding in their family for over 60 years. Her younger brother had carved a small wooden jewelry box, spending countless evenings after his factory shifts, perfecting the delicate floral detailing along its edges. These gifts arrived at the hotel suite, where Grace and Nathaniel would be staying before the wedding, delivered directly into Grace's care 2 days before the ceremony. The afternoon before the wedding, Grace had stepped into the hotel suite's adjoining sitting room to arrange these precious family gifts on a display table, wanting to photograph them alongside a heartfelt thank you card she planned to send back to her family after the wedding concluded. She had barely finished unwrapping the teacup set when Diane, Vanessa, and Brittany entered the suite, ostensibly to help with final wedding preparations, their eyes immediately falling upon the modest collection of handmade items spread across the table. "What on earth is all this?" Diane asked, her voice carrying immediate, undisguised disdain as she picked up the hand-painted teacup, turning it over in her manicured fingers as though examining something faintly distasteful. "This looks like it came from a flea market." Vanessa moved closer, lifting the corner of the handwritten letter that had accompanied the teacup set, scanning its contents with an expression of theatrical disgust. "Grandmother's china," she read aloud, her voice dripping with mockery. "How adorable. I'm sure this cost, what, $12 at some thrift shop?" Grace felt her stomach tighten, but kept her expression composed. Years of diplomatic training allowing her to mask the hurt building beneath her calm exterior. "It's been in my family for 3 generations, she said quietly. "It means a great deal to me." Diane's lips curled into something between a sneer and a laugh, and without another word of warning, she let the delicate teacup slip from her fingers, watching it shatter against the marble floor with theatrical, deliberate carelessness. "Oops," she said, not sounding remotely apologetic. "These things happen, I suppose, when they're made from such cheap material." Vanessa, apparently emboldened by her mother's casual cruelty, picked up the hand-knitted throw blanket, examining it with an expression of exaggerated revulsion before deliberately tearing at one of its seams, unraveling several rows of careful stitching in seconds. "Honestly, Grace," she said, tossing the damaged blanket carelessly toward a nearby trash bin, "we can't have these low-class infections contaminating Nathaniel's new mansion. Can you imagine what people would think if they saw this kind of thing displayed in that beautiful new house? We spent months decorating it properly." Brittany giggled beside her sister, picking up the small wooden jewelry box their brother had spent countless evenings carving, turning it over dismissively before dropping it directly into the trash bin with a sharp, careless clatter. Grace stood frozen, watching pieces of her family's love, hours of careful, devoted labor, being systematically destroyed and discarded in front of her, her expression giving away absolutely nothing, though internally, something inside her had gone utterly, inhumanly still. She thought, in that suspended, painful moment, of her grandmother's careful brushstrokes on that shattered teacup, of her mother's patient knitting through countless evenings after long shifts, of her brother's calloused hands carving delicate floral patterns into wood by lamplight. She thought of every insult absorbed over the past 2 years, every dismissive comment endured for the sake of a relationship she had genuinely believed might eventually earn real acceptance from this family. She understood, standing amid the wreckage of everything her family had lovingly created, that this moment had finally arrived. "You should be grateful we're even letting you into this family at all," Diane continued, apparently unaware of the storm building behind Grace's carefully composed expression. Nathaniel could have married someone with actual family money, actual connections. Instead, he's marrying someone whose family sends dollar store trinkets and calls it a wedding gift. Vanessa nodded in agreement, brushing imaginary dust from her designer blouse. "Once you're living in that mansion, Grace, you're going to need to understand that certain standards need to be maintained. This," she gestured toward the trash bin containing the remnants of Grace's family gifts, "simply doesn't belong in that world." Without a single word, without a flicker of visible distress, Grace turned and walked to the small writing desk positioned near the suite's window, retrieving a slim, unmarked satellite phone from her handbag, a device her personal security detail had insisted she carry at all times throughout her entire period of anonymous exile, precisely for a moment like this one. She dialed a single number from memory, a private line connected directly to the Alderfeld Sovereign Treasury, and spoke a short, precise phrase in a language none of the Kensington women recognized, her voice flat, controlled, utterly devoid of the emotion boiling beneath her frozen exterior. Then she ended the call, set the phone down gently on the writing desk, and turned back to face Diane, Vanessa, and Brittany with an expression of such complete, glacial calm that even they, in their oblivious arrogance, felt an unfamiliar prickle of unease creep up their spines. "What was that?" Vanessa asked, her earlier confidence flickering slightly as she registered something unsettling in Grace's transformed demeanor. Grace did not answer immediately. She simply stood near the window, watching the street below, waiting, while the Kensington women exchanged confused, increasingly nervous glances. Within minutes, the first sounds began reaching the suite, distant at first, then rapidly growing louder, the unmistakable wail of sirens converging from multiple directions simultaneously, followed by the heavy, mechanical rumble of numerous vehicle engines approaching in coordinated, disciplined formation. Diane rushed to the window, her earlier condescension draining rapidly from her expression as she looked down at the street below, where a fleet of matte black armored vehicles was pulling into formation, headlights cutting through the fading afternoon light. 40 vehicles in total, arranged with military precision along the length of the entire city block, effectively sealing it off from any incoming or outgoing traffic. Doors opened in unison as dozens of men in formal dark tactical uniform emerged with disciplined, purposeful efficiency, moving toward the hotel's entrance with unmistakable authority. "Grace, what exactly is happening right now?" Diane demanded, her voice suddenly uncertain, the earlier condescension replaced by genuine alarm. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the suite, followed by a firm, authoritative knock. Grace crossed the room and opened the door herself, revealing a distinguished older man in formal diplomatic attire, flanked by armed guards carrying heavy steel cases whose weight was evident in the careful, measured way the guards handled them. "Your Royal Highness," the man said, bowing his head with practiced formality. "Minister Aldous Hartford, Alderfeld Crown Treasury. We came as quickly as protocol allowed." Behind him, guards entered the suite, carrying the steel cases, positioning them carefully on a nearby table, while Diane, Vanessa, and Brittany stood frozen in stunned, disbelieving silence. "Your Royal Highness?" Diane repeated numbly, the words seeming to physically wound her as they left her mouth. Minister Hartford began unlocking the steel cases, each mechanism releasing with a heavy, deliberate click that echoed through the suite's sudden, oppressive silence. The first case opened to reveal gleaming bars of sovereign gold, stamped with the Alderfeld royal seal, radiating an authority that required no further explanation. The second case contained thick folios of official documents, bound in aged leather, deeds, and titles spanning properties, holdings, and sovereign investment accounts across multiple continents. "This," Minister Hartford announced formally, "represents a portion of the Alderfeld sovereign inheritance formerly belonging to Her Royal Highness, Princess Grace von Alderfeld, sole heir to the Alderfeld dynasty. Vanessa's manicured hand flew to her mouth. Her earlier arrogant confidence completely evaporated, replaced by dawning, horrified comprehension. "This is impossible," she whispered. "You work in social services. You drive a car with a cracked windshield. This has to be some kind of elaborate mistake." Grace turned to look at her, allowing the full weight of her true identity to settle visibly across her features. "There's no mistake, Vanessa," she said, her voice quiet but carrying easily through the suite's stunned silence. "I chose to live modestly for 2 years because I wanted to know if this family could love me without knowing what I was worth." You just answered that question in the most definitive way possible, by destroying the only things my actual family could afford to give me. Nathaniel burst into the suite at that exact moment, having apparently been informed by hotel staff of the commotion, his face pale with confusion as he took in the scene before him. "Grace, what's going on? What is all this?" he asked, his eyes darting between the gleaming gold bars and the guards positioned throughout the room. Grace turned to look at him, feeling nothing but a vast, quiet emptiness where any lingering affection had once existed. "Your sisters and mother just destroyed every handmade gift my family sent for our wedding," she said calmly. "They called my family's love a low-class infection that couldn't be allowed to contaminate your new mansion." Nathaniel's face flushed with obvious discomfort, but before he could formulate any response, Grace continued, her voice carrying devastating, quiet precision. "Speaking of that mansion, Nathaniel, I think it's time everyone in this room understood exactly where that mortgage actually originated." She turned to Minister Hartford, who produced a final document from within his jacket. "The property you've been telling everyone represents your career success," Grace continued, "was financed through a discreet lending arrangement connected to the Alderfeld Sovereign Investment Fund, arranged months ago without your knowledge, as a courtesy extended specifically because I loved you and wanted to see you succeed. That courtesy ends today." Diane's legs seemed to give out slightly, and she gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. Her earlier regal composure completely collapsed into raw, undignified panic. "That mansion is our home," she stammered. "We've already redecorated it. We've already invited people to see it. You will need to vacate the property within 72 hours, Minister Hartford interrupted formally. "The Crown is formally recalling the loan effective immediately, along with any additional credit lines extended to the Kensington family through connected banking relationships." Vanessa's face drained of all color as she realized the designer handbag, the leased luxury vehicles, the carefully maintained appearance of wealth her family had spent years cultivating. All of it existed on a foundation that had just been permanently removed. "Please," Nathaniel said, finally finding his voice, turning toward Grace with genuine, desperate panic. "Grace, please, I had no idea about any of this. Please, we can still fix this. I love you." Grace looked at him, feeling the full weight of 2 years of quiet endurance finally settling into permanent, unshakable clarity. "You watched your family destroy my family's love without saying a single word in protest, Nathaniel," she said. "You asked me over and over to simply endure their cruelty. I am done enduring anything for people who see kindness as weakness and modesty as something to be despised." She turned to Minister Hartford. "I believe we've concluded our business here." As Grace walked toward the suite's exit, flanked by guards whose disciplined formation parted respectfully around her, Diane's voice rose behind her in a desperate, undignified wail, some incoherent plea for reconsideration that arrived far too late to carry any meaning. Grace did not turn around. She walked past Nathaniel without another glance, out of the hotel suite, down the corridor, and into the elevator, descending toward the lobby, where the convoy of 40 armored vehicles waited to carry her permanently away from the wreckage of a relationship built on cruelty she should never have tolerated for as long as she did. The following weeks unfolded with the swift, merciless efficiency that only genuine sovereign authority could provide. The Kensington family's mortgage was formally called due within 72 hours, forcing them to vacate the mansion they had so proudly redecorated, their carefully maintained facade of wealth collapsing entirely once the leased vehicles were repossessed and the counterfeit designer accessories could no longer disguise their actual financial circumstances. Diane's social standing evaporated within the month, her invitations to every social gathering formally withdrawn once whispers of the incident spread through the exact circles she had spent years trying to impress. Nathaniel's accounting position, connected tangentially to firms doing business with Alderfeld Holdings, was quietly terminated, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered among colleagues about the catastrophic consequences of remaining passive while cruelty unfolded in front of him. Grace returned to the Alderfeld estate within the month, resuming her full sovereign responsibilities with a clarity and resolve that had been noticeably absent before her extended period of anonymous exile. She had gone searching for love uncomplicated by her inheritance and had instead discovered something far more valuable, an unshakable understanding that her family's love, however modest in material form, had always carried more genuine worth than every designer label and leased luxury vehicle the Kensington family had paraded so carelessly. Months later, addressing a gathering of young royal advisors during a private leadership retreat, she was asked whether she regretted the painful lessons of her anonymous life among ordinary citizens. She considered the question thoughtfully, then answered with the same quiet, unshakable calm that had once stood motionless while her family's gifts were destroyed before her eyes. "I learned that true character reveals itself most honestly in moments when people believe there will be no consequences for their cruelty," she said. The Kensington family believed a hand-painted teacup and a knitted blanket could be destroyed without cost because they mistook genuine love for something beneath their attention. True power doesn't need to shout to be respected. It only needs to remember patiently until the exact moment arrives to remind everyone precisely what they underestimated. And so, dear viewer, that is how a hidden heiress disguised as a humble social worker watched her family's love shattered in a hotel suite and then dismantled an entire family's carefully constructed illusion of wealth before the sun had even set that same evening. What did you think of this masterful revenge? Did the Kensington family get exactly what they deserved? If you loved watching arrogant elites lose absolutely everything in a single, devastating afternoon, smash that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of karma, justice, and quiet royal power finally reclaiming what was always rightfully hers.